So, this week, behind the headlines, we've got more attacks on the midterm elections and 3 deaths in 7 days involving ICE. So, let's get into it. So, let's start with elections. On July 9th, Trump fired all three remaining members of the Election Assistance Commission. Now, the EAC is the independent federal body created by Congress in 2002 to help states administer elections. It certifies voting equipment, it distributes federal election funding, and it sets standards for voting systems. The two Democratic commissioners were fired by email, and the Republican member was asked to resign by the administration. Replacements must be confirmed by the Senate, but that is a pretty slow process. So, 4 months before the midterms, the only federal agency that's dedicated only to election administration basically has no commissioners and cannot make policy decisions. In doing this, the White House cited the Supreme Court's recent ruling allowing the president to fire independent agency heads as legal cover. Arizona's Democratic Secretary of State called it irresponsible and dangerous, and Senator Chuck Schumer called it a brazen attempt to seize control of our elections before a single vote is cast. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice sent letters to election officials in all 50 states and DC, warning them that they could face criminal prosecution if non-citizens remain on their voter rolls. Now, officials had 5 days to respond, explaining how they would comply. But non-citizen voting is already illegal, and research consistently finds it is extremely rare. Security experts say there's no evidence of it happening at scale. The Utah Lieutenant Governor, who is a Republican, said she'd received another love letter sprinkled throughout with threats of criminal prosecution from the DOJ. One non-partisan election expert called the letters what panic and desperation look like after 18 months of finding no evidence of a crime. The DOJ has already lost more than a dozen court cases trying to get states to hand over their voter data, and these letters basically look like another way of trying to get to the same goal. Finally, briefly, Trump is planning to give a national televised address about newly declassified intelligence on election interference and what the White House describes as voting machine vulnerabilities. Trump says it will relate to the 2020 election. So constitutional law experts and election officials have expressed concern that he's going to use this to again press claims of widespread fraud for which absolutely no evidence has been found ahead of the November midterms. So basically, in the last week, you've got the administration threatening election officials with criminal prosecution. You have an administration that's eliminated the federal body that helps run elections, and an administration that has laid the groundwork for yet another stolen election narrative for the midterms. And we basically got 4 months still to go. Now on to nationalism, and the stories this week cluster around two things: what ICE are doing on the streets and what the administration is doing to protesters against ICE on the streets. On July 7th, an ICE agent shot and killed Lorenzo Salgado Harajo during a traffic stop in Houston, Texas. He was a 52-year-old Mexican national who had lived in the US for more than 30 years and was on his way to work with his construction crew. ICE said that he ignored commands and tried to ram an officer with his van, and that the officer fired in self-defense. But 3 witnesses who were passengers in that van, including the man's brother, gave a completely different account to their lawyer. They said that at no point was an agent directly in front of the vehicle, and that the fatal shots came from the side rather than the front. No body camera footage exists, so ICE said that the officers weren't equipped with body cams because of funding lapses. The Department of Homeland Security later acknowledged that Araujo wasn't actually even the target of the operation. He only resembled the person they were looking for. The Harris County medical examiner has ruled the death a homicide, and his brother, who witnessed the shooting, is now in deportation proceedings. More than 1,000 people marched in Houston's East End in protest, and a local congresswoman said ICE owes this family an apology. Then, a week later on July 14th, a 26-year-old Colombian man called Juan Sebastian Guerrero was fatally shot by an ICE agent during a traffic stop in Biddeford, Maine. ICE said that he tried to flee and that the officer fired, fearing for public safety. But witnesses again dispute this. The Colombian embassy has formally requested information from the Department of Homeland Security, and again, there were no body cameras. The DHS statement explaining why there were no body cams was basically, according to CNN, exactly the same as the one issued after Houston. Now, Guerrero, the Colombian man who was shot, was authorized to work in the US, and he had been issued a social security number, according to the Maine Immigrants' Rights Coalition. And surveillance footage obtained by the Associated Press appears to show that his car was driving slowly in circles near an intersection before an unmarked vehicle blocked its path. a sequence that neighbours and local officials say basically raises serious questions about ICE's account. So again, what we see, there are disputed accounts, there's no footage, there's no independent evidence, and witnesses are basically saying that the agency's version doesn't match what they saw. This isn't new, right? So when ICE shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis in January, Trump claimed that she had run over the agent, but then later video footage clearly showed the agent was standing to the side of the vehicle and that it was turning away from him when he fired the 3 shots that killed her. The DOJ then shut down a federal civil rights investigation into the shooting and withheld evidence from the Minnesota state investigators. And then on to the third case. So on July 14th, which is the same day as the main shooting, a 28-year-old Mexican national died in St. Augustine, Florida, after running from ICE and Homeland Security investigation agents at a gas station. And then he was struck by a tractor trailer on a nearby road and died. He's not been publicly identified, and it's not known whether he or any of the others in the vehicle were the intended targets of that operation. But what it is that's 3 deaths in encounters with ICE in a single week. After this, ICE directed its agents to temporarily pause most vehicle stops, but they didn't publicly announce that. Border Czar Tom Homan described it as a short pause rather than a policy change. But then the next morning, Trump posted on Truth Social that ICE is doing a great job and that we cannot give up on one of ICE's most important and effective crime-fighting tools, the traffic stop. And then ICE activity this past year has been violent over and above the documented deaths. A new report from Physicians for Human Rights and the Human Rights Campaign has documented 412 verified incidents of the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, or pepper spray against anti-ICE protesters between June 2025 and May 2026. 203 of those have resulted in lasting injuries, including blindings and traumatic brain injuries. A former Customs and Border Patrol commissioner have said that agents have violated every protocol on less lethal weapons and crowd control. The report says that the true number of incidents is actually likely much greater than what they've managed to document. So just a couple of other things to note. Trump first sent troops to Washington, D.C. just under a year ago in August 2025 after declaring a crime emergency. And that's something he can do because the city has this kind of unique federal status. The Pentagon has just confirmed that the National Guard will remain deployed in D.C. until Inauguration Day in January 2029. And that will be the longest such deployment in US history. As one constitutional expert put it, an emergency is a sudden, unforeseen, and temporary state of affairs. Announcing that an emergency is going to last for another 2.5 years to some arbitrary date, which happens to be the inauguration, means it's not an emergency. There are now nearly 5,000 Guard members of more than 20 states in DC at a cost, which has been confirmed by the Congressional Budget Office, of more than $3 million a day. So 2 independent studies have both found that the deployment has had no measurable effect on violent crime in DC. So while Trump has been claiming that DC has almost no crime anymore, that's just not what the evidence shows. And then finally, 15 people have been charged with conspiracy in Minneapolis for their involvement in anti-ICE protests. The charges relate to a group called Direct Action Minnesota, which prosecutors have linked to Antifa. Now, Antifa is not a thing, right? It's not an organization. It's a loose label for people opposed to fascism. Now, but Trump still designated it a domestic terror organization last year. The indictment includes serious alleged conduct, so stalking ICE agents, coordinating blockades at federal buildings, and some defendants allegedly advocating violence. But it also includes things like writing a first-person account of a protest for an anarchist blog, or attending meetings, or wearing Antifa-branded clothing. Defense attorneys say that the prosecution is politically motivated and that the process itself is the punishment, designed to spread fear and deter protest activity against future immigration enforcement. So that's it for this week. All of these stories with sources are on TrumpActionTracker.info. See you in a week or two.